Welcome back everyone. On this episode of The Road Chose Me, we're going to talk about the best choice for a camp stove for international overlanding. You might be a little bit surprised to learn the most obvious choice is definitely not the best choice. So I know camp stoves aren't the most glamorous thing to film a video about, but actually I personally think it's one of the most important pieces of equipment you're going to have with you when you set out on your big overland adventure. The reason being is that all of this other kit behind me, the winch, the fridge, the pop-up roof, all of that stuff is really great, but to be perfectly honest, you don't use it all of the time. I mean, the winch, if you're really trying, you're probably only going to use it a couple of times a week. But when it comes to your camp stove, you are going to use it every single day. And so it actually becomes one of the most heavily used items, and it really determines your enjoyment on the road because it will change the food that you can cook and the food that you can eat. And if you can't cook your own food, then you're not going to be inclined to get out as remote, and you're going to want to stay near towns where you can just go to restaurants or buy street food. So for me personally, my camp stove is one of the pieces of kit that lets me get really remote. And if nothing else, it just means I get to enjoy a coffee first thing in the morning. And I tell you what, life isn't really worth facing without a coffee in the morning. Before we talk about what I think is the best choice for a camping stove for international overlanding, let's talk a little bit about some of the choices that I think aren't so good. And let's start here with the obvious choice. This is a propane tank and some kind of burner, you have the hose connection. And while this may seem like a really good option, what most people don't realize is that the majority of countries in the world, they have their own adapters and their own fittings for these bottles and these stoves. So that means if you're going to drive through multiple countries, you're going to have a really hard time getting your bottle filled every single time you cross into a different country. And you want to know how much of a pain this is? When I was in Argentina, I spent 2 whole days with a French couple trying to get their bottle filled. They had a whole bag full of adapters. We made this huge big Frankenstein of a contraption. And even then, after 2 days of trying, we failed to get their bottle filled. So right off the bat for me, that just is a pain in the neck that I don't want to deal with. And with things like iOverlander now making it much easier to find propane filling stations, probably you would manage to get it done. But to be honest with you, do you want to spend your time in Argentina messing around trying to get your propane bottle filled? Or do you want to spend your time in Argentina actually enjoying yourself? For me, I know how I want to spend my time, so this setup is completely no-go for me. And actually what a lot of people do is they have a setup like this, and every time they get to a country with a new setup, they just throw out their whole everything. They throw out their stove, their hose, and their bottle, and they buy whatever locals are using and they start again. So that means if you have something like this built into your fridge slide or some other part of your vehicle, whatever you buy on the street in Guatemala probably isn't going to fit. And so now you've got a whole space problem to go along with your adapter and bottle problem. For me, that's reason number 1 why I'll never use a propane setup like this for an international trip. Reason number 2 that this setup really doesn't work is because those bottles are extremely dangerous, flammable, they can explode, and so shipping companies are really against you shipping your vehicle with one of those inside of it, or in fact on the vehicle. That means if you try to cross the Darien Gap, or if you want to ship across to Europe or Africa like I did, you can't take your own bottle with you. It's against the shipping line rules. Maybe you can lie and get around it, but from my experience, lying to shipping companies is never a good idea. So that means you're going to have to ship your setup without a bottle, hoping you can buy one when you get there. Well, guess what? The one you buy when you get there, it has different fittings on it. Now your setup is half and half. That's not going to work either. Inevitably, you're going to throw out whatever you've got and start again. So for me, not doing it. Also, these bottles, you really don't want to have them inside your vehicle. If that leaks, it can absolutely kill you, especially if you sleep inside your vehicle. So that's something that I would never do on a long-term trip. That means you have to find a place to mount the bottle on the outside. And I realize most people have the 5-pound smaller bottle than this, but even still, that's just another thing on the outside of the vehicle that people can come up and mess with. For me personally, I like to minimize the amount of stuff on the outside just to keep those curious fingers away from my vehicle. So yet again, another reason why this setup is no go for me. So if we're not going to use a propane setup like this one, what other options do we have? That brings me to the next most obvious choice, which is these little disposable canisters with the burner that threads on top. And I mean, these things work well because they don't put out any fumes, which means you can use them inside and you're not going to asphyxiate yourself, and they don't stink. But I've never liked them because you wind up with all of these canisters that just wind up in the landfill. So from an environmental perspective, I really don't like these things. But more than that is that these canisters, they're going to be really hard to find when you're on the road. So maybe a country like Costa Rica will have it, you know, in the capital if you manage to find an outdoor store. But if you wind up in a remote part of Bolivia, the chances of you finding this canister with the right thread on top is extremely slim. So then what do? I've met overlanders who travel with like 20 of these things because they're terrified of running out. And so again, I really feel like this is not a very good option. And personally, it's not something that I would ever think about taking on the road, just because you're limited in finding the right thread and the right canister. So after all of that, we get to the stove that I'm actually using. And you can see how dirty and beat up this is. This is actually the stove that I used every single day in Africa and then all the way across the US. So I don't even know, I've probably cooked 1,000, 2,000 meals on this thing, definitely a lot, and it still works perfectly. So this is a Coleman dual fuel. Sometimes they call it a Sportster 2. I have no idea why. There's a link down in the description and you can have a look on Amazon how much it costs. But the reason above everything else why I use this stove is because it burns gas or petrol. So it burns exactly the same thing as my Jeep, which means every time I'm filling up the Jeep, it's no problem at all for me to just fill up a little container that I can then use the stove. It also means when I'm transferring gas out of my auxiliary tank behind me here for the Jeep, I can just siphon a small amount off that I then refill my stove with. So even if I'm out in the wilderness for 2 weeks, I know that I have plenty of stove fuel because I have plenty of gas for the Jeep. They're one and the same. So this little thing, in terms of the gas burning capability, it just means you have absolutely no problem buying fuel for your stove and you'll always be able to cook your meals. So for that reason alone, this is my #1 choice for international overlanding. It does have a couple of little quirks, one of which is that this part running across the top, which they call the generator, sometimes gets clogged up. I actually bought gas on the side of the road in Ivory Coast that turned out to be probably paint thinner or something else. I'm really happy I didn't put it in the Jeep because it immediately clogged up my stove, which really wouldn't light well, and a big symptom is that it doesn't turn off. After you turn off the valve, flames keep coming out anyway for a long, long time. And that's because there's a little wire that runs down the middle of this piece called the generator, and it actually closes when you turn the valve off. It closes a tiny little nozzle. And so when it gets really badly clogged up with all this carbon on the inside, there isn't a whole lot you can do about it because you can't run a pipe cleaner down the middle. So what I do is I actually carry a spare one of these, costs about $15, and it takes about 5 minutes to take off this generator and put a different one on. So I've done that twice now in all the years I've had this stove, and probably I only had to do that because of the terrible gas in West Africa. I do know that MSR and a few other companies, they make their stoves that look like this, and you can get nozzles for those so that they will burn gas. In fact, I think they can even burn diesel. That's a decent option. The reason I don't like them is because when you buy the stove, it's recommended that you buy the spare parts kit that includes O-rings and washers and E-clips and all kinds of tiny little parts that are going to break and get lost. And I traveled with a German couple actually. Every single morning before they could make coffee, he had to spend half an hour dismantling their stove, getting his hands covered in gas and all of this black carbon to clean out the stove jet before he could put it all back together and then boil water for a coffee. Those things work, but I don't think they're just as durable and simple as this guy is. So for me, this is #1 choice, international overlanding, single burner, simple, and it works. All of that being said, while the little single burner stove is great, I do know that I'm just one guy, and if you've got a family or multiple people, they do make dual burner versions of this thing. So Coleman have been making these since like the 50s or the 60s, and people swear by them. These older ones apparently are super reliable and go forever. So if I had a family, I would absolutely be looking at the dual burner option, and I think that's a fantastic way to go. For me personally, single burner's enough. You get really skilled at single pot cooking, which means you have less dishes at the end of the meal, which when you're overlanding starts to be a really important thing. But yeah, dual burner option I think is really good as well, and I've got a link to that in the description as well if you want to check it out on Amazon. So there you go. Camp stoves, not always something people focus on when they're heading off on a big international expedition, but it bites people who don't plan ahead and they wind up having propane tanks that they can't even fill. They wind up throwing out their whole setup and starting again. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope it gets you thinking about some of the oddball stuff we have to deal with when we set off on these international expeditions, and the kind of videos that I'm going to help bring to you guys to show you the things you need to be aware of and you need to know about. So if you found this video helpful, please give a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Plenty more videos coming, and definitely let me know in the comments below what kind of things are you interested in knowing about. Future videos, what should I cover? I'm going to go into detail on paperwork and bribery and money and all of these topics, but actually whatever you guys want to hear about, that's what I need to be focusing on. So throw in a comment and I'll make those my future videos. Thanks again for watching.